The rain matched my mood that Tuesday, a steady gray drizzle that blurred the world outside the funeral home windows. Inside, everything was polished mahogany and muted floral arrangements, all selected to project the dignity Robert always insisted upon. I stood at the chapel entrance in my charcoal gray dress, the one Robert said made me look presentable, greeting guests with the practiced smile of 40 years as a corporate wife. My fingers were numb from cold and something else, the surreal disbelief that the man I'd shared a life with was gone, just like that. A sudden crash in the rain, brakes failed. No suffering, the doctor assured me. I wasn't sure he deserved that kindness. Our marriage hadn't been a love story for a long time. It was a partnership, I'd told myself, a sturdy, if weathered, house. I'd been the caretaker, tending to every crack and leak, giving up my own career as a financial analyst at his firm because he'd said, "Let me take care of you, Margaret. A man needs to provide." I'd mistaken control for care. The chapel was full of his colleagues, golf partners, and vague acquaintances. I took my seat in the front row, off to the side. The central chair, the one for the chief mourner, felt like a trap I couldn't bring myself to occupy. Our son, Daniel, approached the podium. At 33, he was the image of his father, the same sharp jawline, the same posture of mild impatience. He cleared his throat, adjusted the microphone, and began a standard eulogy about a driven man and a visionary leader. My hands clenched around my handbag. This was it. The moment he would turn to me, his mother, who'd organized this somber pageant, who'd nursed his father through migraines and ego, and say, "Thank you." He finished the prepared remarks and paused. His eyes grew wet. My breath hitched. "There's someone special I need to thank," Daniel said, his voice trembling with genuine emotion. "Someone who was truly family to my father in his final years." My heart, foolish thing, leapt. He'd seen me. He'd finally seen the invisible work. Linda Mallister. The name dropped into the silent room like a stone into a still pond. A soft rustle, a collective intake of breath. From the center of the front row, a woman stood, Linda. Robert's longtime executive assistant, later his consulting partner. She wore a fitted emerald green dress, perfect in its sobriety, and dabbed delicately at eyes with flawless makeup. She gave a modest, sorrowful nod before sitting back down, now the unspoken star of this tragedy. I felt the world tilt. The polished floor seemed to slide away. A detached part of my brain noted the whispers. Sitting with the family? Always thought they were close. Then, as Daniel stepped down, I saw him lean close to her. Heard the murmur, meant to be private but carrying in the hush. "You're the only real family he had left." The teacup I was holding slipped from my fingers, shattering on the parquet floor. The sound was obscenely loud. All eyes swung from Linda to me, the clumsy widow, making a scene. I saw it then. This wasn't Robert's funeral. It was the unveiling of a life lived parallel to mine, and I was the uninvited guest. The house on Willow Lane was a monument to a lie. I returned to it alone, the silence now a roaring presence. I walked through rooms I'd curated like a museum exhibit for a life we were supposed to be living. The Italian leather sofa he'd insisted on, though I found it cold. The abstract art, he said, projected sophistication. My own touches, the knitted throw, the family photos, the well-stocked kitchen, felt like desperate graffiti on someone else's monument. In his study, the scent of his cologne and old paper lingered. I sat in his imposing leather chair, the one from which he'd held court over our lives. The top drawer was locked. A small, defiant spark ignited in my chest. I went to the garage, found a flathead screwdriver, and with a force that surprised me, I jammed it into the seam. The lock gave with a splintering crack. Inside were not business documents, but a curated archive of duplicity. Receipts for jewelry I'd never received. A diamond tennis bracelet, emerald earrings. Hotel reservations in Nantucket for weekends he'd claimed were board retreats. And photographs. Dozens of them. Robert and Linda, smiling on a sailboat, Robert and Linda at a restaurant, his hand covering hers on the table. Robert, Linda, and Daniel, my son, at a Christmas party, all wearing matching reindeer antlers. The date on the back, 3 years ago. The Christmas I'd spent alone with the flu, while Robert told me Daniel was traveling with friends. The final photo stole the air from my lungs. It was a sonogram image, paper-clipped to a bank statement showing a $50,000 transfer to a L. Mallister Medical Fund. The date was 18 years ago. A child? My mind raced, doing the terrible math. Daniel was 15 then. Was there a half-sibling? A secret child he'd supported instead of us? I wasn't grieving for my husband. I was auditing a stranger's life. The law offices of Bronson, Reed and Sharp occupied the 22nd floor of a steel and glass monolith downtown. The air was chilled, scentless. Daniel arrived just after me, offering a stiff, "Hello, Mother." He didn't meet my eyes. Linda arrived moments later, escorted by a junior partner. She wore a sleek black suit today, the picture of respectful solemnity. She took the seat beside Daniel, and he didn't flinch. Attorney Alistair Bronson, a man with the benign smile of a well-fed shark, called the meeting to order. He read Robert's will with the detached rhythm of a meteorologist reporting rain. To my son, Daniel Robert Smith, I leave my stock portfolio, valued at approximately $2.3 million, and my vintage automobile collection. Daniel gave a tight nod. He'd always loved those cars more than he'd ever loved his father's company. Bronson adjusted his glasses. To my dearest friend and most trusted confidant, Linda Marie Mallister, in deep gratitude for her unwavering companionship, intellectual partnership, and the profound happiness she brought to my later years, I bequeath the primary residence at 214 Willow Lane, the vacation property in Nantucket, and the remainder of my liquid assets, trusts, and holdings. The numbers that followed, the value of the house, the Nantucket cottage, the cash, blurred into a meaningless hum. The physical sensation was of being disemboweled. The home I'd polished, the garden I'd coaxed from clay, the seaside retreat where I'd stored dreams of a peaceful retirement, all legally gifted to the woman in the black suit. I turned slowly to Daniel. You knew. He examined his manicured nails. Dad was entitled to his happiness, Margaret. Linda provided it. You provided management. He called me Margaret, not Mom, the final brick in the wall. I was his wife. You were a habit, he said, the clinical cruelty of it breathtaking. Linda was a choice. She understood the man he wanted to be, not just the man he was. Linda placed a gentle, possessive hand on Daniel's forearm. Daniel, please. This is hard for everyone. Then she looked at me, and in her pale blue eyes, I saw it. Victory, absolute and uncontested. It was the look of a chess player who has just declared checkmate. Bronson began discussing transfer timelines. I stood up, my knees held. There appears to be an error, I said. My voice sounded strange, clarion clear. This document is invalid. Bronson paused, peering over his glasses. Mrs. Smith, I assure you, this is the last will and testament of record, duly executed and witnessed. It is a will, I agreed. I reached into my purse, not for a tissue, but for the linen envelope from the basement lockbox. I laid it on the gleaming conference table. But it is not the last will. This is, dated 18 months after the one you just read. It explicitly revokes all prior versions and leaves Robert Smith's entire estate to his wife, Margaret Ann Smith. That's me. The room froze. Bronson's benign smile vanished. Linda's composure cracked, her eyes widening with a flash of raw panic before she could school her features. Daniel looked utterly bewildered, glancing between Linda's panic and the envelope as if it were a poisonous snake. This is preposterous! Linda finally burst out, her voice sharp. Robert would never... He promised you a great deal, it seems, I said, my gaze locking with hers. Promises funded by embezzlement. This envelope doesn't just contain a will, Ms. Mallister. It contains a full accounting, bank statements, transfer records, detailing over $800,000 illegally diverted from Smith & Crest Consulting to you and your various shell companies over the past 12 years. Consulting fees for work never done. Client gifts that never left your wrist. I turned to Bronson. As the sole beneficiary and now the majority shareholder of the estate, I am instructing you to immediately halt all transfers. Furthermore, you will refer this matter to the firm's litigation department. We will be seeking restitution of all fraudulently obtained assets from Ms. Mallister with interest. The silence was profound. Then came the deluge. Linda's outraged sputtering, Daniel's confused demands for explanation, Bronson's hurried attempts to regain control. I picked up my purse. I trust you can handle the details, Mr. Bronson. You have my number. I walked out, leaving the storm behind me. For the first time in 40 years, the air I breathed felt entirely my own. The following weeks were a whirlwind of quiet, precise warfare. I hired my own lawyer, Eleanor Vance, a razor-sharp woman in her 60s who specialized in fraud and estate litigation. "This isn't just a family squabble, Margaret," she said, reviewing the documents. "This is larceny, and we're going to make it stick." Linda fought back with predictable ferocity. She claimed the second will was a forgery, that I'd coerced a dying man. Her lawyer, a slick young man who smelled of expensive aftershave, sent threatening letters. But Robert, in his final act of cowardice or conscience, had been thorough. The will was notarized by a reputable firm unconnected to Bronson. The financial documents were copies of originals he'd secreted away, each transaction highlighted, each fake invoice cross-referenced. He'd even included a signed, sworn affidavit dated 6 months before his death, stating that the earlier will had been drafted under duress and emotional manipulation. The board of Smith & Crest, faced with the prospect of a massive embezzlement scandal, turned on Linda instantly. They provided access to all financial records, eager to paint her as a rogue operator who'd seduced their late CEO. The narrative of the grieving mistress crumbled, replaced by the colder story of a calculating embezzler. Daniel was caught in the blast radius. He showed up at the house one evening, unannounced, his face haggard. "Is it true?" he asked, his voice hollow. "The money? All of it?" "Every dollar," I said, leading him to the kitchen. I made tea, the old familiar ritual. I showed him copies of the documents, the sonogram, the transfers that coincided with his college tuition being too tight for us to afford his first-choice school. The receipts for Linda's BMW that was purchased the same month Robert told me we couldn't replace our leaking roof. I watched the realization dawn, ugly and painful. The understanding other woman was a grifter, and he, Daniel, had been a useful prop in their play. "She made me feel special," he mumbled, staring into his tea. "Like I was in on a secret with Dad, like we were the modern ones, and you were old-fashioned." "I was the bank," I said, not unkindly, "and you were the loyalty test." He broke then, sobbing into his hands, great heaving gulps of shame and betrayal. I didn't hug him. The wound was too fresh, his complicity too deep. But I sat with him in the gathering dark, the mother of the child he had been, bearing witness to the death of the man he'd thought he was. We never went to trial. The evidence was too damning. Facing not only the loss of her inheritance but criminal prosecution for fraud, Linda folded. Her lawyer negotiated a desperate settlement. She would sign over all claims to Robert's estate. She would repay $750,000, the bulk of the embezzled funds, to the company in structured payments, using the proceeds from the sale of the condo Robert had bought her. She would issue a private written apology to me and to the company board. In return, we would not pursue criminal charges. The day she signed the papers, she looked emptied out, the glamour stripped away to reveal a tired, middle-aged woman who'd gambled on the wrong man. She glanced at me once across the table, no triumph left, only a weary hatred. I felt nothing. She was a symptom, not the disease. With the estate secured, I made my own decisions. I sold the monstrous Willow Lane house, its every corner stained with memory. I kept the Nantucket cottage, but I had it renovated from top to bottom, stripping out Robert's dark nautical theme for light, airy spaces filled with my books and the art I loved. The bulk of the liquid assets I used to establish the Margaret Smith Foundation, funding grants for women over 45 seeking to re-enter the workforce or start their own businesses. I called it second act funding. Daniel's journey back was slow and fraught. He entered therapy. He quit the high-finance job he'd taken to impress his father and started a small, ethical tech firm with a friend. He began, tentatively, to call again. To ask questions, not about the money, but about my old career, about my parents, about things he'd never cared to know. 2 years after the funeral, he asked to meet at the Botanical Gardens. We walked among the orchids, a place with no history for us. "I need to understand," he said. "Why did you stay? With him, with all of it?" I considered the question, watching a hummingbird dart between blooms. At first, it was love. Then, obligation. Then fear. Fear of being alone, of being a failure, of having wasted my life. And then, for a long time, it was for you. The illusion of a family. I thought if I held on tight enough, the picture would become real. "And now?" he asked, his voice quiet. "Now," I said, smiling slightly, "I'm not holding on to anything that doesn't choose to stay." He stopped walking. "I'm sorry, Mom. Not just for the funeral. For all of it. For not seeing you." It wasn't a magical fix. Trust, once shattered, reforms into something new with visible seams. But it was a start, a foundation we could both stand on. 5 years to the day after Robert's death, I hosted a party. Not at a stuffy club, but in the sprawling backyard of my new, smaller home, a place I'd chosen for its giant oak tree and sunlight. It was a fundraiser for the Second Act Foundation. The guests were a mosaic of my new life, grantees who'd started bakeries and graphic design firms, my book club friends, Eleanor, my lawyer, a few decent former colleagues from the firm, and Daniel, with his now wife, Priya, a woman with a fierce laugh who'd insisted on helping with the catering. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in watercolor streaks of orange and purple, I tapped my glass. The chatter died down. "I want to thank you all for coming," I began. 5 years ago, my life was defined by an ending I didn't choose. Today, we're here to celebrate beginnings. I gestured to the women in the crowd who'd used the foundation's grants. These women remind me that an ending is often just a stubborn seed, waiting for the right conditions to grow into something entirely new, something stronger, something truly your own. There was applause, warm and genuine. Later, as fireflies began to blink in the twilight, Daniel found me by the fence, looking out at the darkening meadow beyond. "You're happy," he said. It wasn't a question. "I'm content," I corrected. "I'm myself. That's better than being happy. It's sustainable." He slipped his arm around my shoulders. "I'm glad." After a moment, he added, "Do you ever think about her? Linda?" I did. I knew she'd moved to another state, taken a mundane office job. The scandal had faded. She was living the ordinary life she'd spent 2 decades trying to avoid. "I think she was as much a prisoner as I was," I said finally. "Just in a gilded cage of her own making. I won't waste my peace on her anymore." Priya called Daniel over to help with dessert. I stayed at the fence, breathing in the scent of cut grass and night-blooming jasmine. The music from the party, a jazz standard I'd chosen, floated on the warm air. I never got a grand cinematic apology from Robert. The truth he left was messy, selfish, and incomplete, but it was a truth that set me free. The inheritance wasn't the houses or the money. It was the unshakable knowledge that I had survived the wreckage, and on the other side, I had built a life that was authentically, unapologetically mine. The widow was gone. In her place stood Margaret Smith, and her story was just beginning. If this story of resilience and justice resonated with you, please like this video. It helps us share these powerful stories with more people. Subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss our latest narratives about truth, family, and finding your power. Remember, your worth is never determined by how others value you. It's defined by the strength you show when you decide to value yourself. Thank you for listening and for being part of our story-loving family.